Chapter 361, Final Instructions, Final Punishment. The fierce battle in the sky raged on. On the ground, Professor McGonagall and Mad-Eye Moody stood with wands raised, helpless. Neither could find a way to help. It was a feeling of impotence and a growing sorrow. Then suddenly, a soft chorus of sounds rippled through the air around Moody, and people began to appear out of nowhere. Moody's call for aid had worked. Amelia Bones, newly appointed head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement after Barty Crouch Sr., had arrived at the earliest possible moment with over a dozen aurors and an equal number of hit wizards. A resolute leader, Amelia had acted decisively when Moody sent his message. She'd summoned the Auror Office and the Law Enforcement Squad, the Ministry's true instruments of force. She might be misreading the situation, she thought, but she chose to trust the retired Auror. Before coming, she had steeled herself to make the ultimate sacrifice, determined to avenge her family if that was what was required. Standing in Hogsmeade, however, she realized things were simpler and sadder than she had imagined. A blizzard fought across the sky, a sea of white insects filled the air, explosions erupted, and a black cloud blotted out the light, a scene that chilled the soul. Intervention was impossible. Frustration flickered through Amelia, then was replaced by resolve. She ordered her people to erect an alchemical device that forbade apparition across Hogsmeade. She intended to leave Voldemort with no escape. Up in the sky, after Eno's ice magic had built its enclosing loop, he did not relax. He poured out sectum sempra after sectum sempra, giving no quarter. Everyone could see he was trying to overwhelm Voldemort with raw force. It was an obvious gambit, one that relied on Voldemort's pride. Unless Voldemort abandoned his reputation and fled in front of everyone, he would have to endure it. Within the White Swarm, Voldemort felt a sliver of helplessness. Only a sliver. There was no panic. The mountain folk's spirit attacks, the insect sea, the ice arrows, none of it harmed him. Every assault struck a shield charm that hovered a foot before him, not even rippling. Only the repeated sectum sempra cast a note of unease, scraping the shield with a harsh, metallic sound. Annoyance grew in Voldemort. He didn't know when Dumbledore might arrive, and he was tired of waiting. He also felt a small regret. Perhaps using the killing curse so early had been a misstep. Hovering amid the white, he scanned the frozen world, and then, decisive, flicked his wand. Fiendfire. The word was barely audible, but it carried an undeniable, terrible intent. A tiny cluster of vivid, scorching flame blossomed as if staining the pure white sky with an evil flower. At first negligible, the fire nonetheless radiated the power to devour everything. It smelled of an ancient beast awakening. Each flicker warped the air and made the temperature climb. Where the flames touched the White Swarm, they showed a veracity out of proportion to their size. Sky-obliterating billywigs, countless ice arrows, even the invisible sectum sempra, everything disintegrated before the fire as if they were toys under a child's hand. In seconds, the 2-inch flare swelled into a 20-foot-tall, 3-headed rune spore. The flame had become an ancient creature, its metallic, lava-like body towering 2 stories high. The 3 heads yawned in a slow, provocative menace and spat flame into the insect sea. Wherever those flames reached, new rune spores erupted and multiplied, spreading through the sky like a fissioning contagion. In an instant, the pale, desolate world split in two. One half a raging blizzard, the other a hellish inferno. Above Hogsmeade, once the fiendfire had mimicked a living form, Eno restrained the billywig swarm and stopped his assault. The two of them hovered in midair, facing each other in silence. For a breathless moment, neither spoke. Voldemort seemed to be choosing his words. Eno gathered his magic. His amber eyes and dark hair shifted, the irises brightening toward a brilliant blue. "Run! Quick! Everyone!" Moody's shout was almost hysterical. For a beat, he stood frozen. Then he looked at Amelia and his expression hardened. Hogsmeade had been sealed against apparition. "You run. Go as far as you can on foot now." Mad-Eye Moody checked his prosthetic leg, tightened his grip on his wand, and started forward alone toward Voldemort, limping through the snow. Amelia's face crumpled as understanding and regret hit her. She had been reckless. The alchemical device was in place and couldn't be dismantled in time. "Listen to Moody," she said, closing her eyes and tightening her jaw. "Retreat. Try to evacuate as many people as you can, especially the children." With that last order, she followed Moody's example. Many obeyed and scattered, running for safety, but a significant number of aurors and law enforcement officers stayed. With wands gripped tight, they walked in silence toward Voldemort, fulfilling their duty. The department existed to maintain order in the wizarding world, even if that meant standing in the face of annihilation. On the road to Hogwarts, Professor Flitwick and Madame Maxime had felt the disturbance and watched Hogsmeade with growing alarm. Most witches and wizards might not sense much from afar, but the two of them felt a nearly destructive magic building. Simply observing it filled them with desolation. They could scarcely protect themselves, let alone students who hadn't yet graduated. Professor Flitwick leapt off his broom and handed his only flying apparatus to two first-year Ravenclaw girls who had sneaked out. The girls rode the single broom together, dangerous, but no one cared about danger now. As they rose, Flitwick called down final instructions with a twinkle of that old sternness that never left him. Remember my words. Do not break school rules again when you get back, and for your charms homework over the Christmas holidays, add 3 inches. Watching them fly away, Professor Flitwick delivered his last orders, and his last small punishment. Chapter 362, A Promise Hogsmeade, 100 feet above the ground. Sensing the aura of annihilation, Lord Voldemort had tried to apparate at once, but Amelia's precautions had taken hold. His apparition was blocked. He allowed himself the faintest twinge of regret at having provoked a madman. Annihilation magic was dangerous. Even the caster could destroy themselves with a single mistake. Only a lunatic would willingly choose mutual destruction. Still, Voldemort knew the other's mind was not quite right now. From the air, his scarlet eyes swept the square below and fixed on something. A laugh escaped him, cold and scornful. "How ridiculous," he said aloud. "Even at this hour, they're fussing over the sweets they bought. Honeydukes must be irresistible." Voldemort's guess had been correct. Eno had sensed something wrong. Magic affects the mind, and the mind affects magic. Ice magic was not corrosive in the way the dark arts were, but it was inherently cold and annihilating. Extreme cold had no place for life. A practitioner who used it for long could adapt, as with the White Witch of legend, whose temperament was frigid but not necessarily self-destructive. Eno, however, had rarely used ice magic as recklessly as he had today. The effect had been like a muggle drinking a powerful potion their body couldn't handle. At first, watching the snowflakes tumble and the world turn white, his thoughts had shifted subtly. He hadn't paid it much mind. But when Fiendfire ravened and the scarlet flames blazed, they acted as a catalyst. The fiery red sky sickened him. All that remained in his head was to snuff the flames and return everything to pristine white. At the edge of his control, a few familiar words slipped through. Honeydukes, sweets, Hogsmeade. The aura of annihilation thinned. Voldemort, sensing the shift, slipped into the rhetorical mode of his school days, speaking gently and aimlessly about Hogwarts, Christmas dinners, Quidditch, odd stories from the castle's past. Little by little, Eno's expression cleared. When the immediate danger ebbed, Voldemort changed tack, calm now. "Is it worth it?" he asked. "To trade everyone here, their lives, your life, your friends and loved ones in the castle, for one of my Horcruxes?" Eno didn't answer right away. He knew Voldemort cared only for his Horcruxes and feared that if he died, they would be lost. Still, everything Voldemort said made sense. For a moment, Eno felt the tables had turned. He was being manipulated. After a long breath, he replied, firm, "It's not worth it." Then, quieter, he asked back, "But is it worth it for you to trade your last Horcrux for the people I care about?" Voldemort let out a small, almost private sigh. The question was clever and stung. It left him with no easy escape. After a pause, he answered plainly, "Likewise, it is not worth it." Their Slytherin calculated exchange left the situation at an uneasy stalemate. Time stretched. Finally, Voldemort spoke first. "You once said you couldn't go to that place now, and you didn't know if the future could be changed." "Yes, the future is uncertain," Eno said honestly. "Very well, let us make a bargain." Suspended in the air, Voldemort spoke slowly. "We both think it isn't worth sacrificing everything. I will give you 10 years. During that time, we will not interfere with one another." "But my patience is limited," he added. "After 10 years, you must answer me. You should know I was mad once, too." The admission, part threat, part confession, brought a strange, tight smile to his face. Eno read the danger behind it, but weighed his options. Dumbledore could promise nothing. Voldemort could. 10 years of safety for those he loved, even if the rest of England slid back into darkness. Hermione and her parents, Draco, Snape, George and Fred, even Lucius and his wife, would all remain protected. It was not trust in Voldemort. It was a pragmatic choice based on power and interests. Voldemort, while sane, was clear-eyed enough to know that some acts would set off endless conflict. It was like two king cobras in the desert. They seldom fight to the death, but entwine to determine dominance, because each bite could be fatal. Natural selection has a way of favoring such caution. The winner stays, the loser retreats. The pact seemed within reach. "Senior, I have a condition," Eno said, before Voldemort could reply. "In the adult world, whatever we do, do not let it affect Hogwarts." Voldemort considered and, with a faintly lofty nod, agreed. "Good. They are the future of magic, so long as they do not take part." Eno merely smiled at the pretense. This was not about the future. It was a clean exchange of interests. Voldemort had proposed terms and would be bound by them, just as Eno would be bound by his. Voldemort liked to dress the bargain in high-sounding language. "If so, our little visit is over, and next time you change your taste in sweets, remember to tell me." With that, he flicked his wand. The fiend fire hovering over Hogsmeade hissed and collapsed into nothing. Voldemort turned and flew away from the castle, alone. Eno hovered and watched him go. He was exhausted. Dealing with Voldemort in that state had drained him. The last line about changing one's taste in sweets had sounded like a promise not to pry and a warning at once. There were many eyes watching. Looking down, Eno saw hundreds of faces, fearful, adoring, excited, awed, but almost every one of them was fixed on a film mirror or camera, pointed up at the sky with an almost morbid appetite for spectacle. Voldemort had come and gone as he had arrived, quietly, arrogantly. Around Hogsmeade, dozens of adult witches and wizards, including Aurors and Hit Wizards, had held back. None dared confront him. Amelia wanted to move, but Moody gripped her wrist and kept her from stepping forward. The others knew it would be futile and refused to throw their lives away. Xiaodi's share today. Amelia Bones. Amelia Bones was a member of the Wizengamot and, in life, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at the Ministry of Magic. Stern and principled, she once gave Harry and Mrs. Fig a chance to defend themselves and spoke up for Harry in court. Her parents and a brother, Edgar, were killed by Lord Voldemort during the First Wizarding War. In the summer of 1996, the second week of July, she was murdered. Because of her exceptional magical ability and dueling skills, the wizarding world generally believed Voldemort himself was responsible. Chapter 363. Afterwards, angry people. When the world finally fell quiet and the dust settled, the last snowflakes stopped their soft dance. Hogsmeade had emptied of its fleeting spectacle. Only a silver stillness remained, as if time itself had frozen, beautiful enough to intoxicate. With Lord Voldemort gone, Eno drifted down from the air like the last flake of winter. When his feet touched the ground, he ignored the stairs around him and walked straight to where his little house had been. He stopped and stared at the broken walls and the ruins. His home was gone. Maybe it was a stubborn memory or the aimless feeling he'd had since arriving in the wizarding world, but that small Hogsmeade cottage had quietly become the home he recognized in his heart. And now, because of Voldemort's sudden appearance, what had looked like a fight in the sky had already torn his house apart. In a confined space, the boggart had actually managed to suppress Voldemort, but the damage had been done. Professor McGonagall, who had been watching, rushed forward by broom as soon as she could. "Child, are you all right?" she asked, catching his arm with a worried look. "I'm fine, Professor, but my home's gone." Eno turned his head to her, then looked back at the ruined cottage. Hermione's morning preparations were wasted. The enchanted owl McGonagall had given him, one of those transfiguration gifts said to last a long time, had reverted to its original teapot form. "You're the important thing. Everything else can be fixed," McGonagall said and waved her wand. Under the force of a healing spell, the shattered walls and smashed furniture began to knit back together. The healing spell was simple but powerful. Throughout 7 years at Hogwarts, it was the one charm that never left the charms curriculum. Eno had thought of it the instant he obtained the tower's time reversal magic. The difference was telling. The healing spell could reverse damage to non-living things within a certain period, while time magic affected the caster's body. Watching his house reassemble itself, Eno felt something close to relief, though his face stayed composed. Repairing the cottage had been easy. His delay in doing so had been due less to difficulty than to a vague indifference. The sudden, unrestrained use of ice and snow magic had changed him in a small way. When the house looked whole again, he didn't go inside, but stood quietly in front of it, turning over plans in his head. Outside the Harry Potter world, he had no one to consult about ice and snow magic. The only people he could think to ask were Lena in Middle-earth and his former mentor, Hans. Maybe the Arad continent would offer answers, but he wasn't sure how elemental mages compared to wizards. McGonagall watched his inaction with concern. "Come on, let's head back. We'll go to Hogwarts together, back to the castle." At the sound of Hogwarts, Eno's expression softened. "All right, let's go." As Eno and McGonagall rose into the sky, Hogsmeade boiled over. What the villagers had seen and heard left them terrified, and terror quickly turned to fury. Voldemort from 15 years ago had appeared openly in their village. The younger witches and wizards had mostly only heard of him from their parents, but adults over 30 had lived through the dark years. They remembered the madness and slaughter, the ministry's humiliation. They remembered how a force of 50 hit wizards had once been shattered by him, their armor flung aside and their weapons abandoned. Those had been hit wizards, not aurors. Hit wizards are the ministry's heavy hitters, selected for sheer combat ability. They are warriors. Aurors are investigators and trackers. Hit wizards are the army to the aurors' police. That distinction made the story of 50 hit wizards falling to Voldemort all the more terrifying. Defeating 50 hit wizards had been only one of Voldemort's atrocities. During his reign, Dumbledore mostly stayed at Hogwarts guarding the castle. His intermittent interventions were only ever drops in an ocean of terror. That Voldemort had run rampant for so many years, stopped only by a prophecy and the protection of a child, was almost absurd in its drama. Today, Voldemort had shown up in Hogsmeade, England's only wizarding village. Fear spread, and then anger, and that anger was entirely aimed at the Ministry of Magic. If Voldemort could appear openly in Hogsmeade today, who could say he wouldn't appear in their homes tomorrow? If he could walk into a village, he could walk into their bedrooms and curse them. The old English reliance on institutions broke down into public fury. How had the ministry missed this? After the duel of ice and fire, the sky filled with owls again. They became the stars of the evening, a flurry of messengers carrying letters and parcels, some with film mirrors and other devices, winging off in all directions. Tomorrow, Muggle experts might be on television, explaining strange natural phenomena or animal migrations. For now, none of that mattered to Eno. He was guided, more or less against his will, by McGonagall to a private infirmary on the second floor of Hogwarts, next to Madame Pomfrey's office, where the castle could keep an eye on him. Chapter 364. Flying Owl. Professor, listen to me. There's really no need for this. In a pristine white room, barely 10 square meters, Eno sat on the hospital bed and made a last protest to Professor McGonagall. Lie down quickly. McGonagall ignored the interruption, paused, and then rearranged her words before continuing. Never mind. I'll be blunt. What you did back there was not right. It was very wrong. She spoke plainly. For any other student, she might have softened the truth with a white lie, but with Eno, she chose honesty. Faced with McGonagall's frankness, Eno did not hide anything either. Professor, I know what you mean, but I have a preliminary plan, and it's not that serious. Eno knew his condition. He knew it wasn't fatal. As long as he wasn't provoked again or didn't recklessly throw himself into heavy magic, he would recover gradually. After listening, McGonagall finally relented. But you still have to stay here for 2 days. Let Madame Pomfrey check you over and get some proper rest. Merlin, you really scared me just now. Her face was pale. She had been genuinely frightened, not only for Eno, but for the students in Hogsmeade. Many had not evacuated, and if things had escalated, the thought made her shudder. There was also the nagging worry that sending Eno back to his dormitory right away might not be wise. All right, Eno said. I'll stay a few days. It's been 4 years. This is the first time I've had to stay in the school hospital. Let's hope it's the last, McGonagall said seriously. Their conversation did not last long. Madame Pomfrey pushed through the door, this time with a small cart instead of the usual single tray. It was stacked with bottles and jars and several unfamiliar instruments. The hospital was quiet, as was the entire castle. All 4 house common rooms were packed but hushed. Students sat motionless, watching the film Mirror, retrieved from Hogsmeade. The footage opened on 2 figures facing off in midair under a snow-choked sky, ominous clouds swallowing the sun, and shadowy skeletal soldiers moving in the mist. Over half an hour later, it erupted into a scene of swarming insects blotting out the sky, thunderous explosions, and a fiery runespore locked in battle with the blizzard. Minute by minute, the film rewrote what the young witches and wizards thought they knew about magic. Muggle-born, pure-blood, and half-blood alike sat stunned, thinking the same thing. Had Hogwarts been teaching them nothing but parlor tricks? The levitation charms, the dancing fruit, the clever potion brewing, were those all they had ever needed to learn? Even the students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, who had seen the footage, exchanged looks. Fleur and Krum, who had both harbored hopes of winning the championship, now quietly shifted their sights to finishing second. While Hogwarts watched the film Mirror, owls were winging out in every direction. London, Ministry of Magic. The minister's office on the first floor. Cornelius Fudge sat at his large desk, a luxurious 2-foot film mirror on its surface showing a close-up of Lord Voldemort's face. When the image finally faded, Fudge remained frozen in his chair, as if turned to stone, staring at the empty screen. He had known about Voldemort's return a week earlier, when Dumbledore and Barty had come to explain. At the time, he had been dismissive, but had taken precautions, bolstering Azkaban's guards, quietly reaching out to influential pure-blood families, the Lestranges, the Malfoys, even the Crabbe family, preparing for both defense and, if necessary, a change of allegiance. And yet Voldemort's brazen appearance in Hogsmeade had blindsided him. He had not staged a rescue at Azkaban, nor gathered his released followers. He had simply shown up in public. The realization made Fudge cover his face. If he had another chance, he thought, he would have pushed Barty and Dumbledore out into the open immediately instead of keeping things hidden for fear of panic. Now it was too late. The public would point fingers at the ministry, and he, the minister, would be the first to take the blame. A long, weary sigh filled the quiet office. Fudge both loved and loathed the film Mirror. He hated that it had captured Voldemort so clearly, but he could not deny the advantage it offered. In the footage, someone had actually stood up to Voldemort. That someone was not Dumbledore this time, but Swinburne, a younger, vibrant, still ungraduated student. Voldemort's aura of invincibility had dimmed. The image gave Fudge a way to shape public opinion. "I have to see him and get the Daily Prophet in," Fudge muttered, thinking of a remedy for the crisis. It was the same tactic he had used when he first became minister: stand with the figure whom the public hoped in to steady the country's fears. Then it had been Dumbledore. Now perhaps it could be Swinburne. How fast do owls fly? There was no exact statistic, but approximations existed. Depending on the species, an owl's cruising speed ranges roughly between 45 and 100 kilometers per hour. From the end of the Hogsmeade incident until now, in a little over half a day, more than 80% of owls had finished their deliveries. The letters and packages that needed to reach their recipients had by now mostly arrived. Chapter 365, Shockwave, Imperious Curse. Nothing in the world is constant. If anything could be called unchanging, it would be that everything changes. At Professor McGonagall's insistence, Eno had remained in the school infirmary for 2 days. Visitors came, but Madame Pomfrey turned away over 90% of them, including the Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, for the simple reason that the patient needed rest. Eno tacitly approved. He had little interest in fame or power. He only wanted to live well and make life interesting. That was why, after inventing the film mirror, he had declined many benefits. He was simply too lazy to manage them. With Madame Pomfrey blocking the doorway, he was content to enjoy the enforced leisure. The ward was on the castle's second floor. an unremarkable 10-square-meter room with spotless white walls like a quiet world dusted in first snow. Sunlight slanted in through a south-facing window and threw a warm veil over the small space, banishing chill and gloom. By the sill, a carefully tended cluster of hydroponic hyacinths bloomed, their slender stems holding blue and purple flowers whose petals swayed and gave off a faint, comforting scent. It was a peaceful corner. Eno lay on the bed, staring at the bouquet Hermione had sent. When he looked at the flowers, he also saw, in his mind, Hermione's tear-streaked face. She had been genuinely frightened. Despite his repeated explanations, Hermione had insisted on staying nearby most of the day. He let her. He understood her stubbornness. She could have asked Blue Lantern to fetch lunch, but instead she had gone to the Great Hall in person, reasoning that Blue Lantern only knew how to make flower cakes. As the lamp spirit of Grimm-style tales, Blue Lantern's powers were unquestionable. The soldier in the story even had Blue Lantern's spirit away a princess from a palace in the night. As for flower cakes, Blue Lantern stuck to his rules and refused to use anything from outside Shelter Valley. Otherwise, there would be no dish in the world he couldn't cook. Thinking of Sanctuary and Shelter Valley made Eno consider his place in this world. The fight in Hogsmeade had highlighted his weaknesses. He could deal massive area damage, but lacked a reliable, decisive single-target finish. If it were a matter of sweeping hordes of orcs, even 2 Voldemorts wouldn't match him, but against a powerful individual, he could lose. His Annihilation of Ice and Snow was a trump card, but essentially a group spell. He had plans for the Great Annihilation too, and he wasn't going to use it until he reached the White Witch's level. Besides, as a magic that indiscriminately snuffed life, using it could make him exceed Lord Voldemort. And that was a terrifying prospect. Voldemort had terrified many, yet the number he had killed was not enormous, perhaps only a few hundred. In the quiet ward, Eno let the future weigh on him. He'd been a bit overconfident lately. Lord Voldemort had taught him a harsh lesson. A knock on the door broke his concentration. "Knock, knock, knock!" Hermione pushed the door open and came in with a smile, carrying lunch. "Today we have sausages and mashed potatoes, shepherd's pie," she announced. "Oh, and a fresh copy of the Daily Prophet. Same old flattery and denigration. They can't seem to write anything else." Eno took the paper and frowned. The front page headline made him frown harder. "Yesterday's Glory. The Decline of Lord Voldemort." Hermione noticed his silence and cocked her head. Despite her earlier teasing, she felt a flush of pride at the paper's praise of her boyfriend. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. Eno folded the newspaper and let his gaze drift to the silver chain at Hermione's throat, the moonstone necklace. "Nothing. I just think Fudge is treating everyone like fools, and—" He trailed off, then met Hermione's eyes. She understood at once. Of course she did. What couple only stared at one another's necks? She had the moonstone for protection. Hermione's expression sharpened, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "At first, that was my worry," Eno said. The paper's portrayal was a bit too disparaging of Voldemort. "You know how extreme some Death Eaters can be, but Voldemort and I have an agreement." He explained the arrangement without hiding anything. The real concern was time. Only 2 days had passed since the incident, and some Death Eaters might not have learned the news yet. But with Hermione at Hogwarts, she was relatively safe, and after the semester ended, things would be easier over the summer. He also admitted a nagging suspicion that Fudge had ulterior motives. His talent for lionizing some and excoriating others felt too deliberate. Hermione listened, sighed, then thought of her parents in London. From their perspective, compromise might be the only reasonable route. She let out a long breath, conflicted but resolute. "Don't worry," she said. "His biggest mistake was giving me time." Eno squeezed her hand, offering what comfort he could. Meanwhile, in the second-floor corridor, a large, burly figure was coming down the hall. Madame Pomfrey, who had been about to check on another patient, paused. In the last 2 days, she had seen many students try to slip into the ward under the pretense of illness. This visitor was too conspicuous to fake being sick. Still, she stepped forward and asked in her usual officious tone, "Child, can I help you with anything?" A cold voice answered, and the word of a dark spell cracked through the corridor. "Imperio!" Madame Pomfrey froze where she stood, her face slack with shock. The man in the corridor looked every inch a hit wizard, one of the wizards trained by the magical law enforcement squad for armed arrests of dangerous criminals. Hit wizards overlapped somewhat with aurors, but their role leaned more toward direct combat than investigation. To become a hit wizard required at least 5 OWL passes, including defense against the dark arts and a calm, collected temperament. They drew a minimum salary of 700 galleons a month and could use dedicated beds at St. Mungo's for injuries. In 1993, Fudge even declared that only hit wizards might be able to capture Sirius Black when he escaped from Azkaban. Chapter 366. The curse of death wizards are often driven by their emotions. Their world places such weight on feeling that they tend to seem more emotional than ordinary people, and they value those feelings more deeply. The stories we tell bear that out. Lily's sacrifice, Snape's secret devotion, Sirius's self-sacrifice in Azkaban, Bellatrix and Barty's fanatical obsessions. All point to the same truth. Wizards love passionately, and that passion shapes everything they do. That same emotional intensity shows up in action. Death Eaters aren't a single type. Some are cowardly and cunning, others bold and mad, but Barty straddled both extremes. Fiendfire is the most dangerous dark art to control. It doesn't distinguish friend from foe and can turn on its caster. Only a few can command it without killing themselves. Seeing the sky filled with fiendfire made the danger obvious, and it made Barty understand just how difficult it was to hold so much destructive power in check. Still, the immediate blow that gnawed at him was less magical and more petty. The Daily Prophet's sneers. The circulating film and the newspaper's ridicule cut him to the bone. Every insulting paragraph felt like a snake sinking into him. For a follower, watching the man you worship demeaned in print is unbearable. When Barty learned his master was injured and confined to St. Mungo's, unable even to receive a visit from Fudge, he stopped brooding and began plotting revenge. Vincent Crabbe, despite his bluntness, had become a notable figure in Slytherin. With Draco starting the school monthly and Draco's inner circle shrinking, Crabbe's standing rose. He was one of the two who remained. Lately, though, he'd been restless, disappearing for whole weekends. In the Slytherin dormitory, Goyle watched him go. "Where are you off to now?" "Not taking me?" Goyle asked, curious and a little hurt. Crabbe had been rushing about so much that the others noticed. "Buying candy," Crabbe said with a goofy, wounded smile. "Mr. Swinburne always gives all his Christmas sweets to you." Goyle scratched his head, embarrassed. "How about I?" he began, then backtracked. "I'll give you a third." "You keep it," Crabbe said, trying to sound grateful, but his smile slipped at the end. He'd followed Malfoy for years. His only real friend was the dim but steady Goyle. A third of someone's sweets might be nothing to others, but to Crabbe it was proof of loyalty. Goyle mumbled, "I offered. It's not my fault." He meant it in the way only Goyle could. Underneath the small banter there was a deeper sting. Crabbe remembered how Swinburne had looked down on him from the start, cheap candies and averted eyes. Because of that subtle disdain, Draco had begun to rely on Goyle instead of him. The memory of being dismissed in Hogsmeade 2 months earlier nagged at him. Barty had told him then, scorn came from weakness. If he had power, nobody would sneer. He wouldn't be a follower, eating leftovers, playing the fool. For 2 months, Barty had been teaching him dark things. Crabbe loved the power it gave him. Even now, he thought of how easily he could have made the 4 of them disappear. This morning, Barty had sent him one final promise. Complete one last task, and not only would Crabbe meet the Dark Lord, he'd be personally instructed in the dark arts by him. In his robe pocket, the teacup portkey warmed against his leg, Barty's insurance. Whether he failed or succeeded, that portkey would get him away from Hogwarts. That thought steadied him. On the 2nd floor of the castle, Crabbe confronted Madame Pomfrey. The plan was simple. Use Imperio to make her open the ward door and provide cover. He gave the charm and watched her go, the portrait nearby staring in stunned silence. Under the Imperius, Madame Pomfrey walked slowly to the ward, raised her hand, and knocked. Knock, knock. The sound was faint and polite. Inside, Hermione, who had been sitting near the bed out of deference, sprang to her feet at the sound. It seemed improper to remain lying when someone might enter. The door swung open, and Madame Pomfrey, in her white uniform, stepped through. "Thank you, Madame Pomfrey," Swinburne said from the bed with polite warmth. Madame Pomfrey stepped into the room and, obeying the command Crabbe had forced into her, moved aside. Behind her, Crabbe loomed, wand raised, his face hard. Avada Kedavra! A green jet of light, cold as hatred and absolute as death, shot toward the bed. At the same moment, a phoenix cry rang out as Fawkes launched himself between the curse and its target, wings flaring in a shield of song and flame. For a breath, everything seemed as if it would pass without anyone seeing what had almost happened, but one person had not been fooled. Hermione, standing at the bed, had been the first to notice Crabbe's raised wand. Relying on the moonstone necklace she wore, a charm that could throw up a sudden, jerky shield, she moved in one sharp, desperate motion and leapt forward. The sudden turn of events stunned Eno, and his spirits plunged into an abyss. A green beam of light struck Hermione. In an instant, those brown eyes, once bright as stars, went dim. Frost shot! A chilling voice cut through the ward, and dozens, no hundreds of arrows suddenly flew at Crabbe. Before Crabbe could understand what was happening, he was pierced like a sieve. He crumpled to the floor, his left hand oddly still in his pocket. Blood and shards of ice splattered across the corridor. Eno ignored Crabbe. Having cast the spell, he bent over Hermione. Vulnera Senentur, Vulnera Senentur. He poured healing magic into her, chanting again and again. A powerful wash of bright, sacred white light filled the ward. Ah! Madame Pomfrey shrieked. With Crabbe dead, the imperious curse that had been controlling others was lifted. Seeing Hermione collapsed and Crabbe riddled with holes, Madame Pomfrey immediately moved to examine the injured. Around the castle, a different kind of noise spread. Not the usual bustle, but a dull, stunned silence. Portraits, many that had been cheerful only moments before, dried their eyes and wept silently. Professor McGonagall, sitting in the Transfiguration office, suddenly rose. The calm authority she normally bore snapped into something ferocious. Perhaps others in the castle did not fully understand what the sorrow meant, but McGonagall did. 50 years earlier, she had been a student when the castle fell into the same grief, the day Myrtle had died. That memory returned to her now with a chill. On the second floor in the hospital, after a thorough examination, Madame Pomfrey had no choice but to accept the impossibility of what she saw. Both students were dead. The conclusion struck her hard. She sank to the floor, overcome. Hogwarts had not lost a student in more than 50 years. Now 2 had died at once, 2, and both at the very threshold of the school hospital. As a healer, she felt every failing keenly. Perhaps because her own time under the Imperius had been brief, as she came to her senses, she remembered enough to be racked with guilt. If only she had noticed sooner, if only she had been more careful. She leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. In the ward, the healing light continued to flicker. Time blurred. Eno kept casting healing spells until a pale hand gripped his arm. He looked up to find a pair of hollow, lifeless eyes meeting his. "Stop," Snape said, his voice calmer than usual, almost devoid of emotion. Eno, dazed, glanced around. Dumbledore stood nearby, as did McGonagall, Flitwick, Sprout. Many had arrived in force. He wondered why so many had come so quickly. Snape handed him a small potion. "This is for you," he said. Eno swallowed it in one gulp. A bitter, sour taste flooded his mouth, and clarity slowly returned. He realized then what had happened. Hermione had stepped between the killing curse and him. She had taken it to save him. The old castle that had stood for 1,000 years, proud and still as its motto promised, Draco Dormiens Nunquam Titilandus, was shattered by a single dreadful piece of news. 50 years after the last such tragedy, students had died again within its walls. Vincent Crabbe of Slytherin and Hermione Granger of Gryffindor. Only 2 days had passed since the Hogsmeade incident. Among the dead this time was Swinburne's girlfriend, one of the key figures from that earlier confrontation. The calamity had come from nowhere. The news spread like wildfire through the castle and, with the aid of owls, began to sweep the wizarding world. The Daily Prophet rushed an extra edition. On a rocky island off the North English coast, Lord Voldemort stared at that extra edition and seethed. The fragile alliance he had only just stitched together had been dealt a blow within a day and a half. Seeing Vincent Crabbe's name in print made his anger flare. "Stupid! Damn it!" His rage echoed through the abandoned lighthouse. He kicked himself for hiding, for not alerting others, Barty above all, sooner. If he'd informed Barty immediately, perhaps things would have been different. Regret was useless now. Swinburne would certainly retaliate, and that was the last thing Voldemort wanted. The Hogsmeade clash had seemed light, but he knew that if it had dragged on, he would have lost, even if he had used the killing curse. There were too many oddities. The black mist that blotted out the sky had been contained. Some magic had evaporated in an instant and never been used. Magic that, it seemed, neutralized the killing curse. The fiendfire he'd finally unleashed had been no more than a diversion, a way to create chaos and buy him speech. Winning by fiendfire alone was never his plan. The other side had unusual apparition ability that made the killing curse ineffective against them. Voldemort refused to believe that two half-baked fighters could have pulled this off alone. Someone had been miscalculated. Someone had been fanning the flames. Fudge, Dumbledore, names flickered through his mind. Rationally, Voldemort leaned toward Dumbledore being involved. He could not believe that Barty and a reckless student had managed all this on their own. Back at Hogwarts, gloom lay thick. Corridors in the Great Hall were subdued. Footsteps were softer than usual. In the Gryffindor dormitories, the usual racket was gone. Ginny sobbed into Harry's arms. She could not accept that the person she had spoken to that morning was dead just hours later. Everything had been so sudden. Slytherin's common room, in the castle's basement, had fallen into an eerie silence. Draco paced, consumed by worry. Crabbe had been a follower, a constant presence at his side. Old Crabbe had been on good terms with Malfoy's family. Daphne, however, looked more conflicted. Fear and dread were mixed with disbelief. She stole a cautious glance at Pansy, then quickly looked away. Daphne's upbringing taught her to notice who benefited when calamity struck. In her mind, Pansy seemed one of those who might profit. Chapter 368, New Ghost, 8th floor of the castle, Principal's office. Albus, what am I supposed to do? I was the one who took her and her parents to Diagon Alley. I watched her choose her wand. Now I have to tell her parents their daughter died at Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall, who had been composed before, could no longer hold back her tears as she entered the office. She had been the one to bring Hermione into the world of magic. That little brown-haired girl with the rabbit-like front teeth and an innocent, carefree smile. That smile now overlapped in Minerva's mind with the cold, lifeless expression she had seen in the hospital wing. "Albus," she sobbed. A portrait on the office wall spoke up unexpectedly. "Dumbledore, we have guests outside, Beauxbatons and Durmstrang. Shall I open the door?" Hearing that foreign heads were waiting, Professor McGonagall wiped her eyes and hurried to compose herself. In the corridor on the 8th floor, Karkaroff asked in disbelief, "If the three heads agree, can it really be cancelled?" "I've already said it," Madame Maxime declared. "The Goblet of Fire is nothing more than an alchemical artifact. When it comes to alchemy, no one surpasses Beauxbatons." She no longer wished to take part in the Triwizard Tournament. Hogwarts, and even England, felt unsafe. More than any glory, she cared about her students' lives. She wanted them back in Beauxbatons. The first step was to extinguish the goblet and terminate the champion's contract. She expected an argument, but Karkaroff's reaction surprised her. He seemed even more eager to leave, as if he had been planning an escape for a long time. On the 2nd floor of the castle, the infirmary was quiet. In the small ward, the sickbed had been replaced by a blue iceflower crystal coffin. Hermione lay inside, her cheeks still rosy, as if she were sleeping. Eno, who had arranged for the freezing, knew, however, that the appearance of life was only a temporary, rootless vitality produced by continuous healing spells. Sitting by the coffin, he felt a deep sadness. Perhaps he should never have involved himself in other people's stories. Maybe he should have been sorted into Hufflepuff and remained a bystander, stayed at the castle for 5 years and then transferred to Beauxbatons. Maybe everything would have ended differently. But the castle's tale had already changed after the first year. Eno felt regret but not despair. There were, as far as he knew, 2 known methods of resurrection, the ice flower preservation he had used, and a resurrection magic tied to the towers of the Brothers Grimm stories. That was why he had frozen her body immediately. Both methods had unavoidable drawbacks. Either way, the revived would be bound by the sanctuary mechanism, becoming subject to its control, a shared fortune or a shared ruin. "Tell me what happened," said a calm voice. Unlike many of the other professors who had left, Severus Snape had stayed in the ward. After handing over a potion he had brewed, he had been silent for hours. Now his sudden question surprised Eno. Snape was not given to many words, so when he spoke like this, it meant he had been thinking hard. Eno told him everything. Night moved on. The sun set, the moon rose. After Eno finished his account, Snape sat in silence for a long while. Then, without a word, he rose and walked out of the ward. Eno barely noticed. He had been warned. He had expected surprises. For now, the priority was to prepare the resurrection ritual perfectly. The rest could be dealt with later. With Snape gone, Eno was alone again. In contrast, the principal's office had filled with people, the heads of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, Cornelius Fudge, and Ludo Bagman of the Department of Magical Games and Sports. Fudge had come because a student had died at Hogwarts. Bagman represented the ministry regarding the request to extinguish the Goblet of Fire. "Someone must be held accountable," Fudge declared as soon as he heard the news. He had already learned parts of the story through various channels and wanted to establish the ministry's position. "The murderer was a fourth-year student, Vincent Crabbe, but when we arrived, he was already dead," Professor McGonagall replied. "Black used Imperio in the killing curse. Someone taught him those spells, and that cannot be ignored. As for Eno," she sighed, "I will leave Eno to you. I trust the ministry and the Wizengamot will give him a fair hearing." "No." Fudge cut in. "Mr. Swinburne is still a student. The ministry and the Wizengamot must take into account Hogwarts's recommendations." Bagman, representing the ministry's sporting interests, agreed to the requests of the foreign heads to cancel the Triwizard Tournament and extinguish the goblet. Dumbledore, for his part, sat quietly at his desk, saying little, his eyes fixed on a portrait on the wall. Night gave way to dawn. The first light touched the astronomy tower, and a peculiar shifting of magic rippled through the castle. On the second floor of the hospital wing, Eno, who had sat up through the night, opened his eyes. A silver ghost hovered before him. The ghost flitted playfully around the ward, sometimes peering into the ice-flower crystal coffin, sometimes circling the hyacinths on the windowsill. Hermione's spirit, bright and lively even now, seemed to want to explore, to take in the world. "Hermione," Eno whispered. Tomorrow, he would have to step into the tale world of Hans Christian Andersen and attempt the tower resurrection from the old stories, the riskier path, but also the one with a chance of restoring her completely. For now, though, he sat and watched the little silver figure, preparing himself for what had to come. Ghosts are the last impressions the dead leave on the world. They can still speak, walk, and move, but they cannot taste, eat, or enjoy beauty. Hermione now looked like that kind of ghost, translucent, pearly white, insubstantial. When Eno called, she stopped drifting and floated to a halt in front of him. "You shouldn't have been so rash," she said. Her voice was cool, but the worry beneath it showed. "Whatever's done, the ministry will make sure he's punished." "Eno, you were the impulsive one," Eno replied, looking up at her. His eyes were full of concern and a little reproach. "I didn't think it through either. It was just the two of us, and you had no wand. I still had my necklace. You had nothing." In her ghost state, Hermione's perception seemed fixed on the moments before she died. After a long pause, she lowered her head and, quiet and small, asked, "Eno, can you help me? Please cast the memory charm on my parents. I don't want them to be miserable." Eno interrupted, cutting in with sudden urgency. "I can bring you back, believe me." "Bring me back?" Hermione's voice trembled. She had never heard of anyone being truly resurrected. Hearing his seriousness, her astonishment turned to something between hope and disbelief. "Can it really be done?" "I'm serious," he said, "but I must warn you, the conditions are harsh." His gaze swept the room, making sure no one else was there. The shadows under his feet began to spread. In a breath, the ward filled with the black mist of a boggart. The ward was sealed. No one could enter without facing the terror it would conjure. At Eno's words, memories came flooding back for both of them. Hermione drifted to the edge of the ward as images of a summer 4 years ago surfaced. Cheltenham College Junior School, under a tree by the gate, a small stool, a piece of starched, faded linen. Magic was miracles and new beginnings. The letter from Hogwarts was one, but for Eno, there had been other miracles. Enclosed in the boggart's black mist, Eno spoke slowly, telling stories and recalling the past. He described towns and unreliable fathers. He spoke passionately about a princess trapped in a tower, and he told Hermione about Lena, the so-called White Witch. "When you said she'd been resurrected," Hermione said later, puzzled, "you mean she smuggled herself in?" Eno said. He sounded wry. "Not I, but she helped me a great deal. That ice flower she had was the key to her coming through, and it's important to this resurrection too." He outlined the sanctuary's strengths and weaknesses and explained the limitations tied to being made whole again. The sun rose while he spoke. By the time he finished, more than 2 hours had passed. The ward's black mist kept curious onlookers away. The boggart feeds on fear. Anyone with a weak mind who peered at it would see their worst memories made manifest. That thought made one man pacing outside the hospital wipe his brow again and again. Cornelius Fudge stood at the ward's entrance, handkerchief in hand, looking far too flustered for a man who had supposedly become the most powerful in English magic. "There's no need for all this," he kept muttering. "Swinburne had reasons." Professor McGonagall stood beside him, equally uneasy. If she could have stopped the trial and let everything be, she would have. But she believed, in spite of the inconvenience, that a proper hearing would preserve Eno's future, prevent gossip, and make the record clean. The final decision, she argued, should come from the Wiesengemot. Fudge, for his part, seemed to want to delay or avoid the whole thing. His eyes kept drifting down the corridor, and he barely glanced at the ward's black mist. Inside, Eno waited for Hermione's answer. Minutes passed in a tense quiet. Finally, her voice came back, small and wounded. "Will you abandon me afterward, like you did with her?" "How could I?" Eno answered immediately, shaking his head. "You'll be bound to the sanctuary after resurrection, but I have an idea to prevent that from trapping you. We can use magic." Magic? Hermione's interest sharpened. Resurrection filled her with joy and a terrifying hope. She might go adventuring again with Eno, exploring the strange places he had told her about. Even so, she kept some reserve. A girl should hold herself with dignity. Her question was measured. "We'll make a blood pact," Eno said. He explained. Compared to an unbreakable vow, a blood pact is a deeper, more intimate bond. It is not merely an oath. It is a magical connection woven of blood and feeling. Most importantly, a blood pact bars either party from harming the other. It creates a mutual restraint on mind and spirit that is hard to break. "And the token?" Hermione asked. "The sanctuary itself will be the token," Eno said. "That makes the pact effectively unbreakable. The blood pact has a token that can be destroyed to reverse the binding. If the token is the sanctuary, something I control and can protect, anyone who wanted to undo the pact would first have to destroy the sanctuary. That's an endless loop. It protects you from being subjugated. I don't want you to come back and be my subordinate. If one day we go our separate ways, the worst that will happen under this pact is that we become strangers, unable to harm each other, but free." He spoke of tales he'd heard, the story Newt told about Dumbledore breaking a token and reversing a pact, which led to confrontation and bloodshed. Eno wanted a different outcome for Hermione. He wanted her independent. The blood pact, with the sanctuary as its token, would make that possible. It would bind them to safety without stealing her freedom. He finished by explaining the blood pact's essentials as plainly as he could. It is a complex bond based on blood and emotion, designed to prevent direct harm between the signatories. It has a token. Destroying the token can reverse the pact, but that act can cause terrible physical or mental harm during the process. The pact is meant for those closely connected. It is not a casual promise, but a spiritual and emotional restraint meant to keep both parties from harming one another. Hermione listened, the dawn light passing through her like a promise. The idea of resurrection still frightened her, and the price he described was steep. But Eno's plan, dangerous, intricate, and desperate as it was, offered a sliver of something she had not expected to feel again: hope. Chapter 370. Mr. Minister, please do me a favor. The black mist of the boggart rolled over the entire ward. Inside the room, Hermione lowered her head in a quiet hush after hearing about the blood pact. The pact was sealed by blood and emotional bond. Although a ghost couldn't really blush, Hermione's cheeks still went faintly pink. She stared down at her toes, hands folded over her lower abdomen, and for a long moment did not speak. Across from her, Eno was at a loss for words as well. The blood pact was the best solution he could think of, a true all for one, one for all. He couldn't use the sanctuary to force Hermione. That would be a kind of harm, and the essential vow of a blood pact was never to hurt one another. As for the added emotional link, the instant Hermione had thrown herself forward the night before, a lot of things had become painfully clear to him. After Snape left, Eno had put himself in Hermione's place. If it had been her lying there, facing the killing curse, would he have been able to shield her? The answer he found inside himself left him mute. What followed was gratitude. The human heart was a shifting kaleidoscope, and sacrifice always shone brightest. Hermione had acted. He had hesitated. That was why he had no qualms about offering the sanctuary as a pledge. Kindness merited kindness in return. But now Hermione looked torn. Eno cleared his throat. Actually, if you don't want to. No, I do. Hermione looked up decisively. She cast modesty and shyness aside. More hesitation might only breed complications. Are you sure? Eno asked, lifting his head. I'm sure. She nodded gravely. Good. Leave the rest to me. There's some preparation to do. For the first time that day, a smile touched Eno's lips. What about my parents? Hermione asked, returning to the problem that had started it all. Although resurrection is quick, I'll handle that too, Eno said. He smiled and glanced toward the door ringed by the black mist. He could sense someone waiting there, and it would be a good moment for that person to step in. Coincidentally, I know a wizard who's skilled with the memory charm. Then I'll leave it to you. I need to take this chance to experience ghost life. Oh, and Ginny. I'm going to scare her. Hermione slipped through the ceiling. As she drifted away, she poked her head back through the plaster. Oh, right. Tell me when you're ready. Of course, Eno said, firm. Once Hermione had gone, he laid a hand on the ice crystal coffin and vanished. In the second-floor corridor, Professor McGonagall and Minister Fudge stood outside the ward in silence. Just when they had begun to think they would not see Eno today, the black mist around the door flowed away like a tide, and the door opened. Sorry, Professor. I was just talking with Hermione. Eno met Professor McGonagall's eyes. For a moment, the sternness in her gaze softened and moisture gathered. I should be the one apologizing, she said, taking a deep breath. I haven't been a good headmistress. After a few steadying breaths, she added, But now, Minister Fudge has something to discuss with you. Fudge's eyes widened, and he turned toward McGonagall, his face an impossible jumble of shock, confusion, bewilderment, betrayal, helplessness, and a touch of indignation. For a keen politician, losing control of an expression was foreign. He felt wronged. What did this have to do with him? He had been dragged here against his will, and now this. Yet he couldn't argue because the student facing him had already focused his attention on him. It's like this, Mr. Swinburne. Because of Ms. McGonagall's strong insistence, Fudge stammered. There was no avoiding it. Eno nodded and replied calmly, I understand, but not now. I have more important matters to attend to. Of course, those can wait. Fudge visibly relaxed. Go about your business first. Leave the Ministry of Magic and the Wizengamot to me. They cannot blame a student for an accident. Our duty is fairness and justice. He said it with such dramatic conviction, he might as well have been basking in the light of his own righteousness. In all of this, he seemed to forget a time when a Muggle-born girl of 17 had been sent to Azkaban for conjuring a flower at her mother's grave. Professor McGonagall said nothing further. She had seen too many wizards driven to extremes by hatred to push harder. Lecturing would achieve little. With Fudge stepping in, things could be managed, but worry still flickered behind her eyes. Eno inclined his head. All right. Thank you for understanding, Minister, but I do have one more favor to ask of you. Time slid on while they spoke. Hermione's appearance in the Gryffindor common room created an uproar, not because ghosts were unfamiliar, they were ornaments of the castle, but because seeing someone they loved transformed into a ghost had an utterly different impact. Ginny stood in tears, staring at her former friend, a pale, floating figure. The whole common room was subdued. George and Fred had lost their usual grin. Harry, Ron, Neville, Dean, Colin, Angelina, and even Lavender, who never much liked Hermione, quietly dabbed at her eyes. The shock was raw and visible. Underground in the castle, Snape had taken a sealed box from a shelf in a hidden room. Inside lay neatly arranged resound bird feathers, an essential component for brewing Veritaserum. After learning what had happened the night before, Snape felt a chill of déjà vu, the killing curse, the instant fatality, an echo of Godric's Hollow. He would not stand idle. Magic had counters, legilimency could be blocked by occlumency, and some oath magic could even restrain legilimency. But Veritaserum had no known countermeasure. The Veritaserum he intended to brew had been refined for 14 years. Chapter 3371, Seaside City, Mr. Hans. Far from the English mainland, out in the vast blue ocean, sat a small rocky island that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The island was never touched by sunlight. A permanent overcast hung low, thick leaden clouds blotting out warmth and color. This was Azkaban, a name that made wizards blanch at the mention. In the part of the prison reserved for lighter sentences, Gilderoy Lockhart curled in a corner of his cell and stared numbly at the gloomy sky. He had been there for exactly 1 year and 175 days. What had begun as fanciful hopes of rescue from fans had slowly given way to bitter reality, and then to numb resignation. He felt the biting sea wind and heard the relentless crash of waves on the rocks. Loneliness was the constant companion of Azkaban. Leaning against the cold stone, Lockhart felt an unfamiliar regret. His past fame, the glory, the flashes of cameras, they all seemed distant and meaningless. Instead, fragments of his school days in Ravenclaw Tower grew unnervingly vivid. Every class, every moment, even the quarrels and barbs with Rita were clear as day. After calculating the time to be sure the Dementors would not return, he activated his memory mode once more. The past unfolded again, and he was back in a second-year charms class. From an observer's perspective, he watched Professor Flitwick demonstrate the freezing spell at the podium, and, like the other young wizards below him, he copied the motions. It wasn't the first time, but in Azkaban, he could only attend the same classes over and over, reliving warmth and ordinariness he had once taken for granted. Freezing cold, the small, cold cell grew several degrees colder. Lockhart pointed to the opposite wall, and the spell hit. A 2-foot patch of frost spread across the stone. Wandless magic. If this had happened before Azkaban, he would have shown it off at the right moment. Now, all he wanted was a steady job when his sentence ended and to enjoy a normal, quiet life. If possible, he wanted to offer Rita a belated apology. Footsteps suddenly echoed through Azkaban, cutting the silence. Lockhart lifted his head. His golden hair, once immaculately kept, hung matted and tangled, but his eyes were still bright. "Gilderoy Lockhart, your good fortune has come." The hit wizards on duty announced themselves from the corridor. Accompanied by 2 of them, Lockhart looked back at the prison as if he'd been away for ages. "Don't drift off. Do this right, and the minister may commute your sentence." The guards tried to reassure him. Everyone who walked out of Azkaban had that same expression. "Just make 2 muggles forget their daughter?" he asked, confirming the mission he had been given. Not permanently, only a temporary forgetting, and no damage. They must be able to fully recover later. The hit wizards repeated the conditions gravely. Lockhart understood how crucial the task was. Any mistake would help no one. "I understand," he said, and nodded. A year and a half in prison had wired the memory charm deep into him. 2 days passed in a blur. Under Madame Pince's reluctant gaze, Eno borrowed several books on the Blood Pact. He spent the time holed up in his old hospital room, almost hermit-like. He summoned his suitcase from the dorm and called back Fide and Corvus, who had been wandering outside. After he tidied the small 10-square-meter room, the 2 phoenixes, one red, one blue, landed on his shoulders. "I have to leave now," he said. "Lockhart's already handling your parents. Don't worry, there won't be any harm." His voice was steady. "Do you want me to come?" Hermione asked softly from midair. She had become a ghost, and she floated there, concerned. "I meant to go with you, but you really shouldn't." Eno shook his head. Although Hermione was a spirit, he wasn't sure whether the sanctuary would accept her. Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes had taught him that the rules around death were complicated. If Crabbe had become a ghost, he might have tried an experiment, but the castle had refused Crabbe because he was a murderer. He couldn't risk dragging innocent ghosts into a test. "Trust me, it'll be quick," he promised. I trust you, Hermione said, nodding. After a short farewell, and under Hermione's watchful gaze, Eno pulled out the odd-shaped die and crushed it between his palms. Under the morning sun by the seaside, fishermen moved about the docks in linen and conical hats, mending nets and preparing boats. Their clothes were simple, but contentment showed on every face. Beyond the busy pier rose an ancient stone city wall, worn by wind and salt and softened with moss, yet still standing like a faithful guardian. Eno paused and took in the scene. The phoenixes in Hermione's small coffin, for reasons known only to the warped rules of this world, were safely packed in his suitcase. Not far off, beneath a bitter melon tree, a barefoot, middle-aged man sat playing a 2-foot winged harp. He wore a loose plain robe and gazed slowly out at the sea. There was nothing extravagant about his looks, but his clear, slightly melancholic eyes left an impression. The man seemed to sense the attention and turned his head. "You've grown taller," he said in a calm, gentle voice like a breeze. "Have you been well all these years?" Hearing that soft, familiar tone washed a long-lost peace over Eno. "Not very," he admitted, then smiled. "But I'm so glad to see you, Teacher Hands." The seaside was beautiful, a long sweep of golden beach, soft fine sand that glittered under the sun, and waves that broke in steady rhythm like the ocean whispering to the coastal town. Far off, sea and sky melted into one, azure blending into cerulean so seamlessly it was hard to tell whether the sky reflected the sea or the sea hung in the sky. They sat under a bitter fig tree. Professor Hands, middle-aged, with a melancholy that deepened whenever he frowned, listened to Eno's reply and furrowed his brow. Almost as if in answer to his expression, the sound of the sea dulled and the breeze slackened. "Don't like it. If you want, you could stay," Hans said after a moment. "If you'd said that when we first met, maybe I would have," Eno sighed. "But now, it's a bit late." Hans chuckled and picked up the winged harp he always carried. He plucked a few notes and hummed as he spoke. "Years pass. Decay only touches the skin. When enthusiasm is abandoned, decay reaches the soul. Don't worry, child. It will be all right." The familiar chord, the familiar tone, relaxed Eno completely. He took off his boots, dug his toes into the warm sand, propped his suitcase up as a pillow, and lay back beneath the fig tree. Hans's soft zither drifted over the beach and was answered by the waves. At some point, a flock of white seagulls crossed the sky, their calls bright and graceful against the blue. In that atmosphere, Eno closed his eyes. The chill that Iceflower's magic had left in him faded. His hair, dulled before, regained a dark sheen. The day moved on. Morning became noon. Noon bled into dusk. Fishermen returned to the pier telling their families of the day's fortunes, smiles unchanging whether haul had been rich or pitiful. The clamor of voices woke Eno. "Wake up. If you sleep any longer, we'll miss dinner." Hans smiled. "Sorry, Professor." Eno pushed himself up and sat. He and Hans watched the boats, and finally Eno spoke, slow and steady. "A friend of mine. She died." He told Hans why he had come. Iceflower might be able to bring her back, but Eno knew neither the procedure nor how to open the link to the Middle-earth where Lena was. Delay would only make things worse. He had come to his old mentor hoping for guidance. "That's a pity," Hans said calmly. "But if she has died, then let her be brought back." He turned away from the pier. "I remember you asking about the golden apple tree. By chance, they will ripen in a few days." Something in the way he said it made Eno pause. As he opened his mouth to mention Iceflower, Hans stood up. "I'll go get dinner. Dead fish is cheap tonight." He took a few copper coins from his pocket and ambled toward the pier, barefoot, leaving his harp leaning against the tree. That evening, a bonfire burned on the beach. Hans roasted fish, while Eno laid out candies he'd collected at Christmas, gifts he'd never shared after the Lord Voldemort incident, stored back in his dorm until now. He'd tucked them into his suitcase before leaving. "Professor, can golden apples really resurrect someone?" Eno asked as he arranged the last piece of candied jackfruit. "Of course," Hans answered. "In my experience, it's the surest way to bring someone back." He smiled. "Don't worry. In a few days, a swallow will bring them." Eno was stunned. Such a priceless thing. Delivered? The idea felt unreal. Hans seemed to read his confusion. "Don't worry. Golden apples are meant to save lives. Besides, nobody else can harvest them. But Swallow's errand will ask something in return." Eno said nothing. Hans had already done more for him than he could repay. Just the divining dice had steadied him through hard times, but there was always a reason behind generosity. He accepted the grilled fish Hans handed him and watched the days pass. A week went by like a blink. On the morning of the 7th day, the fishing fleet slipped out to sea again, and Eno reached for his accordion, preparing to head into town with Hans to play for coins. Yet Hans stayed under the fig tree, motionless. "Professor," Eno began. "Shh! Look." Hans held up a finger and pointed. A golden glint crested the horizon. It resolved into a beautiful swallow midair, and in its beak it carried a golden apple nearly the size of the bird itself. The swallow landed lightly and set the fruit down, panting as if it had flown a long way. When it spoke, its voice was surprisingly young and clear. "Are you the one who wanted the golden apple? Mr. Black Swan." Eno froze at the odd nickname. "I do want it," Hans said, playing innocent for him. The swallow fluttered its wings. "Then you must do me a favor." "What is it?" she laughed. "I'll give you the apple if you'll help me care for a little duck. No, a swan. She's one of us, but she's miserable right now." Eno took the golden apple. Far away in Hogwarts, the great hall was quieting down. A farewell feast was winding to an end. The goblet of fire had gone out, and Beauxbatons and Durmstrang would leave the next morning. Hermione, ghost-like these past days, drifted through the hall. She'd been told it would be soon. She had waited a week and had seen the painful limitations of a spirit. At the laden tables, she could only look at food she could no longer touch. Then the hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward her. She slowly raised her hand. Where her palm had been a lifeless pearl white, there now shone a golden radiance, and that light spread, her arm, her body, bathing in soft, brilliant gold. The glow was dazzling yet gentle. Hermione felt weight return to her limbs. Her lost senses came flooding back, the damp tang of the sea breeze, the sweet smell of pastry in the great hall. Under the gaze of professors and students alike, her body rose higher and higher, a comet of golden light lifting into the night. Xiaodi's share today. Blood pact definition. A blood pact is a deeper, more binding magical connection than a simple oath. It is forged through blood and emotion and emphasizes a prohibition on harming the other party. Those bound cannot directly injure one another. Characteristics. The consequences of violating a blood pact are not always explicitly stated, but the pact generally prevents direct harm between the parties. A blood pact has a token that can be destroyed. Breaking that token may inflict physical or mental harm. It is rooted in emotional and spiritual restraint and is typically formed only between individuals with close ties. Chapter 373, Golden Shooting Star, Hogwarts topic. If someone asked what magic truly is, perhaps no one could give a single definitive answer. But if they asked what magic can do, the answers would be many. Transfiguration to make wishes come true, apparition to travel the world, flying freely on a broom. Yet no answer ever seemed to include one thing: resurrection. Hogwarts' Great Hall fell into an almost stunned silence. Students from Beauxbatons, Durmstrang, and Hogwarts crowded the benches, but the start of the feast, normally so raucous, was muted. Under everyone's eyes, Hermione Granger's ghost suddenly turned gold, a brilliant, dazzling shimmer like a tiny rising sun that outshone the floating candles. The light washed over the hall and warmed the hearts of those who witnessed it. But as Hermione's figure streaked upward and vanished into the night, the silence broke with a shock. Even many older professors had never seen a ghost change color and take flight. The reactions at the head table were a tangle of grief and awe. Professor McGonagall tried to stifle a sob. Professor Flitwick watched with tight concern, and Snape and Dumbledore both stared skyward as if they could catch the light. Nearly headless Nick hovered nearby, his voice trembling with something like envy and admiration. "She was very brave. She let go," he said, repeating himself as if to convince himself. "Even if she was only a ghost for a week, she was very brave. She moved on." As a centuries-old resident of Gryffindor Tower, Nick knew the lore. A ghost disappears only when the living have finally let go, when the tether of regret is released. Other ghosts in the castle confirmed and explained it, and many in the hall quietly offered their private blessings to Hermione. It was the kind of moment stories live for, one that would be retold with relish for years to come. Up above, the Scottish night was flawless. Stars pricked the sky like scattered jewels. Hermione had no idea how long she'd been flying. The great castle grew smaller until it was only the faint smear of orange from fireplaces and candles, like a scatter of glowing insects beneath the heavens. She lifted her face to the stars she had once studied in astronomy class and now felt, for the first time, as though they were within reach. She didn't know how long she drifted among them. Just as boredom began to creep in, one distant star flared into sudden brilliance, and Hermione, dazed by the light, closed her eyes. 3 miles down the coast from the noisy docks and the city's glittering lights, a quiet fishing village slept close to the sea. As dawn approached, the fishermen put out to work, and the village thinned to only children and the elderly. On the edge of town, a simple cottage, weathered by years, sat like a forgotten corner of time. Soft sunlight filtered through sparse clouds, painting the bare room in warm, lazy patches. The interior was spare and orderly, an old wooden table that had borne years of use, a few light bamboo chairs, and incongruously, an ice-blue crystal coffin lay in the center of the room. Eno stood beside it, holding a small, brilliant golden apple. He placed the apple gently on Hermione's chest. The instant the fruit touched her, it seemed to melt like liquid honey, spreading a faint golden sheen across the coffin. In a corner, the middle-aged Hans sat half asleep in a bamboo chair, a window wide open to the sea at his back. Wind carried salt and the wide, steady rhythm of waves into the room. Only the sea and the breeze kept the room company until Hermione's voice, soft and hoarse, came from the coffin. "I want honey lemon water." Her eyelids fluttered open. The starlight still stung her eyes. Through the haze she saw a face she hadn't expected to see. "Eno, Eno," she breathed. Hans's eyes snapped fully open at once. He stood, gave a small, patient smile, and walked to the window, leaving space for the two of them to speak alone. Half an hour later, Hermione sat with a cup of pale yellow honey lemon in her hands, watching the simple room with an expression that mixed curiosity and relief. Everything was plain and unpretentious, yet the sensations of warmth, of being solid and present, made her feel profoundly grateful. When she drained the cup, she set it down slowly. "Is this the other world you told me about?" she asked. Eno nodded and exhaled with something close to reverence. "Yes, a world of miracles." Hermione let out a small laugh that was half a sob. The miracle of her resurrection pressed against all her memories of being a ghost, of the first 2 days when it was novelty, and the long, gnawing stretch afterward when it was only torment. Wandering the castle like an intruder, watching the living go about their lives, belonging to neither world, she now understood, with painful clarity, the endless ache of that state. She had trouble imagining how nearly headless Nick, who had drifted through those halls for centuries, endured it. She looked down at her hands, flexing fingers that felt foreign after the chill of death. "What about the other ghosts?" she asked, voice small. "Could they?" Eno's face grew solemn. "Some things can't be changed." He chose his words carefully. "Rules are rules. Miracles happen, but they're exceptions, rare, special, and not something you can apply to everyone." Hans, still at the window, watched the sea with his back to them. His features softened. He seemed to find his own kind of peace in that endless horizon. Around them, the day came on slow and sure, and the little cottage, warmed by the pale sun and the soft sound of the surf, held a quiet proof that for reasons no one could fully explain, one life had been granted back. Chapter 374, A Lost World, like a fairy tale. Perhaps it was the shock of being brought back to life, or the slow easing of panic as she adjusted and munched candy after candy, but Hermione had begun to relax. The golden sand along the shore was breathtaking. She rolled up her trousers and waded barefoot into the waves, bending now and then to pick up gifts the sea had left, bright, iridescent shells. Under the bitter tree, Eno watched her for a moment, then turned to the man beside him. "Hans, teacher, thank you. I didn't expect the golden apple." Hans, middle-aged and calm as ever, replied in that placid voice Eno had come to expect from a professional bard and diviner. "It was nothing. It was meant to be." It was the kind of statement they always made, grand, inevitable. Eno accepted it outwardly, but inside he had been carrying questions for a long time. He felt, with that prickling certainty prophets sometimes inspire, that if he let this chance slip, he might never meet Hans again. "Teacher," he said finally, To be honest, I'm still puzzled. He leaned his shoulder against the trunk. He'd been puzzled since the beginning. On his 10th birthday, he'd opened the door to the orphanage washroom and inexplicably found himself in a fantasy world where he'd met Hans telling a story. At the time, he hadn't thought too much about it. But later, when other threads began to align, tiny oddities stood out. The first entry point, the first person he met, and the strange die that let him go straight from the castle into the story world without passing through the sanctuary. He had treated it as a life-saving item, nothing more. Hermione's quiet resurrection, however, made other things make sense. Even legends like the White Witch, who could raise worlds and rule Narnia, who could even wrestle subtly with the creator's lion, could only send out a single seed, and even that seed was planted by a roundabout route. Hans listened, then at last said in a tone more serious than usual, "Before you leave, I will give you the answer, but you still must finish helping the girl swallow. After all, she picked the apple." It wasn't a full explanation, but it was an answer nonetheless. That was enough. Eno felt a wash of relief. Nothing is more frightening than the unknown, and prophets and seers are respected because they can lift a corner of the future. If Hans would speak before he left, then waiting a little longer, after all those years, didn't matter. Evening brought life to the little room. Hermione and Swallow sat talking, their laughter clear and bell-like. Eno worked quietly at the table, cleaning the fresh seafood he'd bought that day. He'd been surprised that Hans had chosen to put down roots, however briefly, in a small fishing village, but he didn't press the question. Bards wandered. Sometimes they stayed in one place for a while. It was a choice, nothing more. After dinner, Eno opened the suitcase he'd carried with him. He had rarely used it. He'd grown accustomed to traveling rough, but with another person here, he wasn't going to let Hermione sleep on the floor. This wasn't the old case he'd kept Acromantula in. It was a gift from Nicholas, made of warthog leather. Magical creature leather carried magic of its own, so even after he'd had it expanded to hundreds of square meters with a subtle extension charm, its structure remained stable and secure. Dawn. In the clear blue air, a swallow rose and swept ahead, free and effortless. Ahead of it, Swallow rode that bird. A dark black swan followed some distance behind, and behind them all trailed a 3-foot flying carpet. Hermione sat on the carpet beside the suitcase, riding the gentle undulations and grinning like a child. She'd already taken flying at Hogwarts, and yet the carpet made her feel like she was truly flying. A broom feels more like riding a bicycle in the air, she said to herself, and quietly resolved, when I get back, I'm going to learn Animagus too. Eno had other concerns. During their talk, the day before, he'd realized that this entry must have matched time flow with the world they'd left. Hermione's immediate craving for a sweet and sour drink after being resurrected hinted at it. Later, she'd mentioned a week had passed at the castle, and the goblet of fire had been forcibly extinguished. Those details were worrying in their own right, but what mattered more to Eno were the familiar names, Voldemort and Barty, and the shadowy people who might be pulling strings. He owed Swallow a favor and had to repay it while he was still alive. Debts left unpaid become meaningless otherwise. He beat his wings hard to keep up. The Black Swan's top speed approached 100 kilometers an hour. An exceptional swallow could hit 350. The flying carpet was essentially a single-rider model he'd bought during the World Cup, designed, likely, for sales, hardly the many-person wonder of the tales. They crossed cities and ridgelines, the landscape passing in a blur until dusk softened the world. Gradually, the swallow decreased speed, and the three of them drifted down. Eno looked out and felt the breath leave him. The sky above them was the washed blue of a polished sapphire, scattered with white clouds that wandered and gathered into dream shapes. Sunlight pierced them in slants, laying warm, soft gold over everything. The land below was equally luminous, as if carved and painted by a patient nature. Birds sang in branches, flowers opened like small suns, foxes trotted along paths, rabbits skipped in the grasses, raccoons went about their business. A clear stream wound through the valley, flashing like a silver ribbon. A few leaves floated on its surface. Waterfowl skimmed leisurely, leaving delicate ripples. In the middle of the river, a graceful flock of white swans played. Along the banks, ducks dabbed and preened. There was no noise but the music of life, nothing harsh, no machinery, no disturbance. Every detail hinted at artful design and an ancient wonder. Suspended there, Eno felt he'd stepped into a long-forgotten corner of a fairy tale. "We've arrived," Swallow called, her voice bright. A cry behind him cut the air. "Oh my goodness, what happened?" Eno whipped around. Hermione was gone from the carpet. In her place sat a small, silver-gray sea otter on the 3-foot rug, its paws pressed to its head. It stared at them with a face between astonishment and disbelief, round dark eyes reflecting the strange, perfect world around them. Chapter 375, posting a single chapter. Sorry, everyone. There will only be 2 updates today. I haven't been in the best state the past few days, and with a lumbar muscle strain, sitting causes a dull ache. The recent plot twists have left some readers dissatisfied, and I, Xiaodi, offer a sincere apology to my subscribers. The apparent plot holes will be filled, they won't be left hanging, and Hermione's cause of death will be explained. In fact, there was foreshadowing today, but I won't spoil it. I also promise not to radically change original character settings. For example, Dumbledore will not suddenly become some kind of white dark lord. The castle is still the same castle, the fairy tale is still the same fairy tale, and the story remains the story. To those who haven't read the book and are only following others' opinions, sincerely, it's better to part ways than to stay together begrudgingly. Finally, bowing and apologizing. Shout PS. It's a bit sentimental, but I'm sincere. Chapter 376, Animal World, The Ugly Duckling and Miss Sea Otter. If I were you, I wouldn't make such a fuss, Miss Sea Otter. Swallow's voice cut through the air, clear as ever. Hermione sat gracefully on the flying carpet, staring at her 2 tiny silver-gray paws, at a loss for words. She had seen sea otters at the London Aquarium and liked them well enough, but that didn't mean she wanted to be one. If she had to become an animal, her eyes drifted to the elegant white swans gliding on the riverbank. It's all right. This should only be temporary. Eno beat his wings, flew to Hermione's side, and gently tapped the little sea otter's head with his long swan beak. A sensation passed through her, and Hermione tilted her small head at a 45-degree angle. With dark, honest eyes, silver-gray fur, and 2 restless little paws, she looked utterly adorable. If you can, you should do it now. It's that tiny speck down there, Swallow said, coming closer. Following his gaze, Eno looked at the river and saw a scene hidden among the reeds. Animals had their own hierarchies. In the center of the river floated a group of elegant swans. Not far from the bank, in a patch of burdocks, dozens of ducks played in the water. On the periphery of that flock clung a smaller group, like yellow shoals pressed to the edge, hesitant to approach the ducks in the middle. The leader of the outer group was an adult duck with a green head and neck and mottled brown back, clearly the mother. Behind her waddled black and gray ducklings. And at the rear was a figure almost the size of an adult duck. Though large, its feathers were pale grayish-white down, giving the impression of an overgrown chick. "You see, this is how the world is," the duck mother lectured. "But remember one thing. If any of you meet Mrs. Rafe in the middle, you must bow your heads. She's the most famous here. She has a red cloth tied to her leg. That's the greatest honor a duck can have." All the ducklings nodded dutifully, including the last larger one. Their noisy responses drew attention. "Look, more strays come to beg. Ugh, that duck is so ugly," a half-grown duck snapped, pecking at the large duckling. That seemed to be the signal. Others began to peck, to circle, to mock. "Please don't bother her. She won't hurt anyone," the duck mother said, stepping forward to plead. But there were too many ducks, all watching the commotion. "But she's so ugly. She's the ugly duckling. She's different. That's her fault. She's crude. She should be beaten." The ugly duckling shrank behind her mother, bewildered by the mockery and by the occasional sting of pecks. Ever since she'd hatched, she'd been pushed around, ostracized, derided. She sank into deep self-blame and confusion. What had she done wrong to deserve this? Was being different really a crime? She hid her head beneath her wing and floated motionless on the water. "Enough! That's enough!" A voice full of anger rang out. All the ducks, including the duck mother and the ugly duckling, looked toward the other side of the river. A silver-gray sea otter floated there. Small, only about 1.5 feet long, but to the ducks she seemed enormous, 2 or 3 times their size. Hermione's chest tightened. She had read The Ugly Duckling, but she had never expected the cruelty the book described to look so raw and real. Seeing the bewildered duckling, she saw a mirror of her younger self. When she first arrived at Hogwarts, she had faced the same kind of exclusion for being different, liking to study, to earn points, to answer the professor's questions. In my opinion, the ugly duckling is more beautiful than all of you put together, Hermione said, her voice ringing across the water. Fear flashed through the ducks, but in the ugly duckling's eyes something new kindled, an unprecedented brilliance. Hermione smiled faintly. She had placed herself in the duckling's shoes. She had found an answer. Perhaps at the library entrance that day, it had been like this. From then on, without realizing it, the former Mr. Twang, liar, quietly became Eno. High above them, Eno had been watching the river all along. You saw that too. That's always how it is. Little swans get bullied. It's not the first time, Swallow said as he skimmed in tight circles. Swallows were fast, but hovering wasn't their strong suit. Leave it to the sea otter. No, leave it to Miss Sea Otter. No one can handle it better than she can. Eno turned his head and spoke calmly. Nothing has meaning, but everything has its meaning. He recalled Professor Hans's words and understood a little better why he had gone to such lengths to care for a little swan. Maybe it was Professor Hans's way of making amends for Hermione. Perhaps compensation had begun the moment of the golden apple. He didn't truly believe Hans would have hurt innocents on purpose, but the accident had happened, and resentment lingered. Like the young Grimm brothers, well-intentioned but disastrously naive, things had gone badly. Had the story's ending not been pre-written, Eno thought he might not have survived that self-immolation in the tower. Under the clear blue sky, a black swan drifted into view and watched the river quietly. The scene shifted again. Perhaps the sea otter's words hadn't been enough, or perhaps she was no longer content with arguing. She paddled her small paws and surged toward the duck flock, making her stance clear with action. Hermione's size gave her an advantage, but she had to protect the ugly duckling and face a crowd of ducks, and she still wasn't fully comfortable in a sea otter's body. Gradually, she found herself at a disadvantage. Once, twice, 3 times she was pecked, but Gryffindor courage showed. The sea otter took on the semblance of a young lioness on her first hunt, standing up to a pack of hyenas. Still, one against many was a precarious thing. As more ducks joined in and Hermione grew more overwhelmed, Eno knew it was his turn. The 3-foot-tall black swan beat his wings. His dark feathers caught the sunlight and shimmered with iridescent hues, black but alive with color. After all, animal vision was not the same as human vision. Chapter 377. As time goes by, Hermione changes night fell. The bright moon hung high, casting a soft glow. The river lay like a sheet of silver, dreamlike and mysterious. A gentle breeze carried a coolness and a faint fragrance. Reeds, burdock, morning glories, and countless cosmos. The plants along the banks swayed and rustled in a natural, soothing symphony. By the river, beneath a dense stand of reeds, an elegant black swan rested quietly on a bundle of hay. Beside him slept a beautiful silver-gray sea otter, Hermione, her fur soft and warm. She lay with her eyes closed but replayed the last few days in her mind, the moments before her death, her rebirth, scene after scene. It still felt unreal, even though it had happened. Only today, after a fierce quarrel and even a fight with the ducks, did she feel truly alive, solid and real, not like a dream she could wake from. As she began to drift off, Hermione stretched a little paw and gently stroked the black swan's soft feathers. He returned the small caress by pressing his wing against her, and comforted, she fell asleep. At dawn, the sun rose, spilling warm golden light across the magical world. The animals opened their sleepy eyes, everyone but Mr. Owl, who was preparing to curl up for a good nap. The lake that had been so peaceful at night grew lively again. The swans took the best places in the center, the ducks gathered more modestly at the edge. But today there was a difference. A pure black swan, with a small sea otter companion, swam freely through the water. Eno, what do you think Odette usually eats? What do swans eat in general? She's always hungry. Hermione paddled along and tilted her head to ask. Odette was the name she'd given the ugly duckling, borrowed from the White Swan Princess of Swan Lake. I don't know what Odette eats, but I do know what swans eat. A pleasant, elegant female voice answered. Hermione turned to see an exceptionally beautiful white swan, snowy feathers, a bright red beak like a blooming rose, a proud, graceful neck. Sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, the white swan continued. They told me yesterday a handsome black swan had come to this river, so I wanted to come see. Oh, and I didn't notice this little one before. Are you upset? The white swan's voice was warm. For some reason, Hermione suddenly thought of the black tea served at breakfast in the castle. I'm not upset, but my friend doesn't like to be disturbed. Hermione said this while glancing at Eno. The sea otter tilted her head adorably, the fifth cutest animal in the world, undeniably cute. And Eno stretched his wing to ruffle her fur. As you can see, he agreed, and the two turned and glided toward the other side of the river. Swans are omnivores, the white swan said. We eat small fish, clams, water plants, and various berries. Then let's go ashore and pick some fruit for Odette, Hermione suggested, looking longingly at the lush forest on the bank. Good, the white swan replied. He was curious about the forest's inhabitants, too. Talking of animals in stories, no one did it better than Anderson Mother, the rose elf, the princess and the pea, the nightingale, the old street lamp, even the phoenix. There were so many tales. Swans are one of the most special creatures in fairy tales. Proud, yes, but rarely cast as villains. In The Ugly Duckling, the swans simply advised him to leave rather than mock or attack. Swans also take longer to mature than many water birds. Depending on the species, it can take 18 to 24 months, at least a year and a half, for a cygnet to grow. But in this peaceful animal world, time seemed to matter less than anywhere else. Whenever Miss Autumn Cicada and Mr. Cricket played their duet, the animals knew summer was slipping away. Autumn arrived. The forest path lost its lush green and took on a new coat of fallen leaves, a golden carpet that rustled softly underfoot. Maples burned like fire, ginkgos glowed gold, only the pines and cypresses stayed green. Among the trees, Hermione sat with squirrels, sharing the nuts they had just collected. The scene might have seemed odd, but it felt harmonious. Eno watched Hermione with a quiet smile. Unconsciously, they had been living in the forest for more than half a year, from the 100-flower spring to this joyous autumn harvest. The peaceful life had settled over him. He understood now that Teacher Hans had not only come to help Hermione, but also to help him. For months, he had lived like a swan. He had not used magic and had not even opened his undetectable extension handbag. And yet, his innate magic seemed to have been nourished by this life. It had grown steadily, becoming purer and more stable. Feeling the season's harvest and vitality, Eno smiled without noticing how much more often he found himself doing so. The coldness that had come with his ice magic had melted away. This change was only about temperament. It did not weaken his bloodline magic. If anything, his power had been refined. He raised his head and looked up at a sky bright and clean as washed blue. A vague feeling stirred inside him, the sense that if he wanted, he could summon a winter that would truly come, an honest, falling winter, not the forced weather tricks he'd used before. Still daydreaming and grinning? Let's go. With these nuts, we won't starve this winter. Hermione leaped off a tree stump and gave the swan a playful nudge. Oh, and Odette, she's growing up too. Along the forest path, the silver-gray sea otter chattered on, a bulging bundle of leaves tied to her back, jingling as she walked. Eno felt a flash of familiarity at the sound, a memory of when he ran a fortune-telling stall outside a primary school and liked to attach broken wind chimes to his canvas bag. The little charms had created a unique sort of charm all their own. Chapter 3.8, The Truth of Everything. Xiao Di thinks this chapter is important. Winter had come quietly and cold. The river that had once run silver and rippling was now frozen and dusted with snow. By the riverbank, in the hollow of a sheltered tree, the little sea otter miss burrowed under the black swan's wing. The soft velvet warmth made her narrow her eyes in contentment. After a long while, she spoke. Eno, I don't want to go back. Hermione's voice trembled with a gentle longing. This life, peaceful, untroubled, far from clamor, had taught her a kind of happiness she'd never known. There were things she disliked in the forest, like the wily fox or the noisy flock of ducks, but none of it mattered when they were together. Eno felt Hermione's reluctance as clearly as she did, but he had no choice to offer. No one can stay in a story, he said quietly. When the story ends, we have to leave. But what about later? Hermione asked. She sighed. Let later be later. There are so many things I still don't know, Eno answered calmly. Compared with Hermione's reluctance, he was more worried about Hans's reply. 18 months had passed, and the ugly duckling had changed enormously. When the ugly duckling finally became a white swan, many questions should be answered. Hearing this, Hermione stopped pressing. After a year and a half alone, she had learned restraint. She had learned that Eno often couldn't decide. He usually just accepted things. Their conversation dwindled, and silence settled in the little hollow, broken only by the sound of cold wind outside. Someone once said that winter's arrival meant spring was near. When the snow melts and grass pushes up again, a new year begins. The forest bloomed once more. The sky was an almost painfully clean blue. One black swan and one white flew side by side. Miraculously, on the black swan's back perched the 1.5-foot-tall sea otter Miss. A small suitcase was tied to her with 2 ropes, looking from afar like a child with a satchel. Odette, go back. You don't have to see us off, Hermione said to the white swan as they flew. The world ahead isn't yours. Will we ever meet again? Odette, the former ugly duckling, now a white swan, asked sadly. I don't know, Hermione answered, voice tinged with sorrow, but I will never forget you. Eno remained silent in the sky, flying steadily like an expert coachman, though he too didn't know what to say. For a year and a half, it had been Hermione who had done all the work raising the ugly duckling, feeding it as a chick, guiding it as it grew, even defending it when it was bullied. She swung the sea otter Miss's little paws to strike back whenever necessary. The ugly duckling had been raised by Hermione. At Hermione's urging, Odette no longer followed them. Before she left, the swan plucked a feather with her rose-colored beak and handed it to Hermione, then turned and flew toward the dreamlike forest behind her. They arrived and left at dawn. Facing the rising sun, Eno carried Hermione through the sky. By evening, they had come to the seaside fishing village again. Same beach, same gnarled tree, the same figure sitting beneath it. Middle-aged Hans waited there, his expression more melancholy than before. Eno descended slowly, and the moment they touched ground, the black swan and sea otter Miss melted away, replaced by 2 human figures of nearly the same height. 18 months had smoothed Hermione's childlike naivety. She stood tall and composed, sharp-featured like a champion from Beauxbatons, grown into an adult. I'll wait here. Hermione shook her head. She knew some things she could be part of and some things she should not be. She did not intend to attend Eno's meeting with Hans, even though she had learned everything there was to know over the past months. After she spoke, Eno nodded and walked alone to the gnarled tree. Under the tree, Hans had not changed in appearance, only in the look he carried, older around the eyes, more tired. Eno sat beside him without question, just as he had when he first entered this impossible place. This was an accident, Hans began slowly when Eno sat. Everything started as an accident, he continued, taking a simply bound book from his cloth pouch. I wanted to make the stories more interesting. Look, everything you want to know is inside. Eno had his suspicions, but he took the book anyway. The paper felt rough, like palm leaves. When he opened it, words appeared in red and blue ink. Familiar names, familiar tales. This was an early version of Hans's stories. As he turned the pages, Eno noticed a pattern. The red ink appeared at turning points. The blue ink filled in the rest. In The Ugly Duckling, for example, the red ink marked only 3 moments. The swan egg found in the duck's nest, the bullying, and the transformation into a white swan. There wasn't much text. Dozens of stories, some long, some short, ending within an hour. But when he reached the latter half, his guess became clearer. A passage described a small boy who accidentally opened a bathroom door and stepped into a magical world. Eno felt no shock reading that. He had lived it. But the book's later pages astonished him. After the tale of old John the Shoemaker, whole stretches of the book were blank or filled with strange symbols, snowflake marks, intricate runes, characters that belonged in Greek myth. On the final page, the red ink returned after a long absence, 3 times on one page. The grown boy returned to his original place. Then the blue ink described war in Hogsmeade and Hermione's death. Seeing the casualties, the red ink returned again. The boy saved his friend with a golden apple. Eno saw the account of the experiences he and Hermione had shared. At the very end, the red ink concluded, Hans's story ends here. He closed the book and handed it back to Hans, sinking into thought. Hans had clearly been the cause of Eno's miracles. He had been the one to invite him into the tales. Eno should have continued traveling through fairy tales, but something had gone wrong. After leaving Old John's town and before the first school year, the narrative had shifted. He remembered that upon entering Hogwarts, the sequence of stories had changed. Narnia, The Lord of the Rings, Grimm's fairy tales, Greek myths, and that turning point had coincided with magic. It was as if the story lost its script once he reached Hogwarts. Hans spoke again, his voice quiet and apologetic. I am sorry. It was an accident. I saw your fear and longing in the orphanage, and I wanted to change my story by inviting you. But once you entered that castle, something unknown began to alter things. The stories became uncontrollable. I tried to call you back to prevent accidents, but I failed. An accident still came, Eno said. Yes, Hans agreed. He exhaled and continued. Fortunately, the ending wasn't bad. While I still had power, I altered the story. Listening, Eno felt like a crowd at the end of a bard's performance, waiting for the curtain call. He opened his mouth. Teacher. Listen, Hans interrupted. Do you remember what I told you when you first arrived? From their unspoken bond, Eno thought a moment and answered automatically. Years may wrinkle the skin, but to give up enthusiasm wrinkles the soul. Exactly. I am not afraid of time. Hans nodded and stared out at the wide, churning sea. It's just that I lost my original enthusiasm. Perhaps the moment I invited you in, my own story was already destined to end. There was a sudden weight to his demeanor, an age that hung from him like a cloak. It wasn't a change of face. It was the way he carried himself, older, like someone who had completed a great journey. Sea otter, miss. Hans called softly, the sea breeze carrying his voice to Hermione. Mr. Hans. Hermione walked over to the tree and instinctively spoke differently now, no longer Mr., but teacher. She looked at him with a sorrowful earnestness. I'm sorry. Because of me, you suffered death. Hans looked at her with sea-colored eyes and a flicker of apology. I can't pay you back. I am only a poor bard. He smiled wryly. Eno and Hermione watched as Hans slowly tore the book. The page he ripped out was the one where the small boy pushed open the bathroom door. As a bard, I can only give you stories. And, of course, a writer's pen. Hans produced another object, a branch of chestnut wood about 9 inches long, sharpened at one end. Then he turned his gaze to Eno again and gently patted the winged harp that hung at his waist. This harp is for you. Don't think I didn't know. You played it secretly many times. Before Eno could reply, Hans's body began to glow with soft starlight. The glowing figure and the torn page rose slowly into the sky, and about 30 feet up, the form dissolved into countless points of light, like fireflies in spring, like stars on a midsummer night, like lanterns in winter. The specks climbed into the night, from the enchanted forest to the grand city, from remote mountain hamlets to endless snowy ranges and the fathomless sea. Animals, people, elves, merfolk, hidden witches, and devils, everyone looked up involuntarily. The summer night glittered with 1,000 brilliant stars. On the shore, the waves kept beating, the sea wind steady. Hermione was the first to break the hush. Is this the end of the story you told us, at the cost of Hans's life? She spoke the title without thinking, Teacher. Eno looked up at the stars and answered, Hans's story has ended, but our story has only begun. Hans hasn't truly died. For a being like Hans, life and death were not simple measures. Perhaps he was like a bard who, having finished a tale, wandered to an inn for a night of sleep and rose at dawn to travel and tell again. That's a relief. I don't hate him, Hermione said, fingers tracing the chestnut pen and the torn page in her hand. The moment she took them, she felt a strange space open in her mind, an ice-covered path lined with red maple trees bearing pages of stories, an ice flower swaying, and even a 70-foot-long anaconda of ice and snow. She felt she could move freely within that space. She tried to make the anaconda crawl forward toward a valley of flowers and a river of rainbows at the path's end, but the valley was visible and untouchable. She could perceive it, but not interfere. Eno crouched and picked up the winged harp Hans had left him. He plucked the strings. A gentle melody floated out, soft as the sea breeze. Let's go back, Hermione said. It's been 18 months. Maybe we've been forgotten. That's true. I miss Mum and Dad, too. Hermione squeezed Eno's hand, and as a gust of sea wind lifted them, they faded from the shoreline together. Hans's story had ended, and Eno's was only beginning, along with the Grimms and other tales waiting to be lived. Chapter 379, 18 months. Voldemort is scared. Time is a strange thing. 18 months can turn a fledgling into a swan. 18 months can also cloud the wizarding world over England once more. Lestrange Manor. In a richly furnished but slightly dated drawing room, an oval table was crowded with people. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Ha ha! This is fascinating. Resurrection. This even outstrips magic. Lord Voldemort sat at the head of the table. His tone was light, even amused, but his scarlet eyes were cold as ice. After a moment, the laughter died away. You know what makes the greatest fools? Hating someone they've never met and being proud of things they've never done. I don't want you to become those fools, like Barty Crouch Jr. He scanned the gathered faces with a calm, almost clinical gaze. More than 20 people sat below him, some deferential, some fanatical. All of them had been the most loyal Death Eaters, recently returned from the deepest holds of Azkaban. Once, Voldemort might have cared little for such pawns. Now, after seeing a glimmer of hope, he valued them as useful eyes and ears. They could gather intelligence, information he wanted but could not yet seize. He was disgusted at Barty Crouch Jr.'s unauthorized actions. Not only had Crouch violated their agreement, he had needlessly created a mortal enemy. Even if Barty had surrendered to the Ministry, some things could not be mended. Once a crack appears, a patch only delays what's coming. For now, his efforts were all about patching. Swinburne's sudden appearance, the secret of resurrection, the rules behind that rite, all of it would have to wait until Dumbledore was dealt with before he could set plans in motion. Thinking of that, Voldemort looked sideways at the burly man at the table. Fenrir, how many wandering werewolves have you gathered? Fenrir Greyback, vicious, notorious, went suddenly meek at the summons, terrified. Master, so far I've mustered 276, he said. The rest were persuaded to stay away by Remus Lupin, at the cost of giving Wolfsbane potion. Fenrir faltered and lowered his head, bracing for punishment. It did not come. Instead, Voldemort's voice, flat and cold, offered a kind of reassurance. 276? That will do. My dear professor always thinks in grand designs. Let his grand designs fall to ruin. Send those werewolves to harry the Muggles. They do not need to win glorious victories. They must not sit idle. The quiet voice carried the most chilling command. Around the table, Bellatrix and Goyle looked openly indifferent. The rest, Fenrir, Lucius, and others, altered their expressions at once. Fenrir thought of the pack he had painstakingly recruited, suddenly reduced to tools. He pictured the day he might be sacrificed. Lucius thought further. Attacking Muggles to create panic was a direct breach of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy. If the statute were shattered, it would no longer be an internal wizarding matter. The consequences could be disastrous. Voldemort sat and watched them all, with the lazy contempt of someone who did not care about the private thoughts behind practiced faces. So long as his commands were obeyed, their feelings were irrelevant. That will be all for today. Fenrir, Lucius, stay. After a beat of silence, the meeting broke up. The Lestrange estate grew quiet again, corridors emptying. Lucius, Voldemort's voice called, slow. Your Malfoy instincts are as sharp as ever, he said. It almost makes me envious. Master, Lucius rose, eager to show fealty. Do not be nervous. Sit. Voldemort waved him down. I do not intend to harm you. Deliver a letter to Swinburne. Barty may have surrendered, but that does not explain everything. Lucius felt a rush of relief at the understated tone. Helplessness and relief threaded through it. Voldemort's helplessness came from the need to compromise. If his rivals joined with Dumbledore, his chances would be slim. The relief was simpler. Swinburne had surfaced at the Ministry, if only briefly. That was enough. Ever since Swinburne's disappearance from Hogwarts, Voldemort had been on constant guard. A Slytherin snake hides and waits for the right moment to strike. Better to have many spies than to watch alone. For that reason, he had rescued these Death Eaters, and now he could rely on them again. Lucius left with the letter. Its weight felt heavier in his hands than it should have. That same afternoon, in a three-story middle-class house in the Stone District of Manchester, Eno set the envelope on the guest room table with no expression. Hermione noticed at once. They had been together long enough to read one another. "What is it?" she asked. Eno shrugged, letting a small, humorless sound escape. "A note from Lord Voldemort. He's afraid." Hermione laughed, incredulous. Voldemort afraid? Hard to picture. She had been back for 3 days since everything had settled. With Lockhart's help, her parents' memories had been restored. She was home, surrounded by family and by the person she loved. Life felt warm and ordinary again. "So what will you do?" Hermione asked, careful not to disturb their fragile normality. She could guess Eno's thoughts. He knew her well enough to know she would not compromise on certain things. "You know you can't pretend a viper doesn't exist just because it's sleeping," he said. "If you ignore it, you never know when it will wake and bite." "I know," Hermione sighed. "But Bardi's in Azkaban. A surrender doesn't solve everything." Eno's voice hardened a little. "He won't escape this time, and I'll find a true seer, otherwise the Horcrux problem never really goes away." He considered how a wizard's crup is punished if its tail isn't clipped and a muggle spots it, an apt analogy. Some threats required more than a quick fix. Then Eno reached for the small harp he kept in the room. His fingers spread and began to pluck a simple, country tune. The notes rose like clear water, simple, soothing, carrying the scent of streams and open fields. The melody filled the room and blew away the heaviness that had just settled over them. Chapter 380, Snape's Visit. After slowly plucking the harp strings, Eno fell silent. He had been planning to visit the foreign-eyed seer, imprisoned in the High Tower himself, to ask about the location of Lord Voldemort's last Horcrux. A charlatan who tossed dice to divine chances would not do. A true seer could peer through a crystal ball and see what they wanted, whether future events or people in the present. Compared with Trelawney, whose visions were hit or miss, Eno trusted Grindelwald's gifts more, though consulting him might demand a price. Still, against Voldemort, a once powerful but now broken Grindelwald seemed the lesser danger. Mid-August in London felt slow and languid. Every breeze carried the last warmth of summer and the first coolness of autumn. On the 7th day after the story had ended, the Granger residence received its first visitor, one they had expected and who had every reason to come. Snape's arrival did not surprise Eno. The fact that he had waited a full week was, if anything, restraint. "Professor, some things can be replicated," Eno said bluntly in the guest room, "but some things are unique." He did not bother with pretense. Hermione's resurrection could not be duplicated, nor could the golden apple or the world where Professor Hans had once lived be entered again. The pages that had recorded that story were torn, familiar as an ancestral home, but like children leaving, there was no reason to return to live there. Snape seemed to have expected that answer. He did not become emotional, but the light in his eyes dimmed noticeably. "I knew it," Snape said quietly. Eno could only fall silent in return. He still had an ice flower he had not used, but whether such an item could restore someone dead for over a decade, whose bones had decayed, was unknown. He was not willing to risk giving false hope. The cruelest thing is to promise hope and then fail. He would not string Snape along with lies, easy though that might be. They sat across from each other in a heavy silence, punctuated faintly by the television in the next room and the occasional laugh from Hermione. After a moment, Snape rose. "I understand. If you need anything, write to me." As he moved to leave, Eno quickly stopped him. "Professor, about Harry, have you thought of a solution?" He did not have many ideas about the story's protagonist, but he could not ignore Snape's concern. The 7 years had boiled down to one thing: Harry finding Horcruxes and destroying them. In the end, Harry had even sacrificed himself, yet fate had spared him. He had not truly died. That happy ending had relied on Voldemort using Harry's blood in his resurrection. Now things were different. Voldemort had been resurrected with Barty Crouch Sr.'s blood. That distinction was significant. Hearing Harry's name, Snape sat again. "I'm looking for a solution," he said. "A potion." "A potion?" Eno raised an eyebrow. He did not doubt Snape's skill. It was just he had never heard of a potion for the soul. Snape did not hide anything. He understood all too well that someone like Eno could coax him with false hope, or control him, or consent to being deceived for the sake of one last glimmer. The student in front of him had simply acknowledged that resurrection was impossible. That left Snape with a complicated mix of disappointment and relief. Yes, the wolfsbane potion gave me an idea. Snape spoke with the composed calm of a man in his element. Lycanthropy has puzzled wizards for centuries. There are theories, but no single definitive answer. Wolfsbane treats the symptoms. It suggested a direction. He continued evenly. Aconite, black hellebore, acromantula venom, extracted and carefully brewed, they can produce a slow, irreversible poison, a poison that eats at the soul. He said poison, as one might describe a cup of pumpkin juice, utterly calm. Eno felt a jolt of admiration. Snape's mastery of potions was not merely reputation. To be inspired by wolfsbane and conceive of a brew that could damage the soul was the kind of work few wizards could imagine. If such a potion worked as Snape described, it would be a stable method. It could weaken a soul fragment so that Voldemort's remnant could never surpass Harry. What surprised Eno most was how Snape could claim to know the potion's effects at all. A soul-sapping brew was not something one could deduce by sniffing a vial or using a revealing charm. But he did not press for details. Everyone keeps some secrets. The fact that Harry's problem had an answer was enough. The specific mechanics could remain buried. Fate, he thought, had a strange sense of irony. Voldemort, the champion of pure blood, had his destiny shaped inside a muggle's home. Late August found them in Austria, where Atlantic influences meant a cool, temperate climate. The thermometer had dropped to about 10 degrees Celsius, refreshingly crisp. For muggles, Austria was famous for Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. For wizards of a certain age, one place was unforgettable, Nurmengard. About 20 kilometers from the castle, the village of Alpbach greeted a young man and woman that day. Time had brought changes not only in temperament and experience, but in bodies as well. Hermione wore a silver-gray tracksuit and white sneakers. The outfit made her already tall frame seem even more energetic and spirited. Beside her, Eno wore a matching tracksuit in plain black. "Hermione, why don't you explore for a while?" he said. "I need to finish what I came here to do." He lifted his head toward the low western sun, his gaze skimming the sparse woodland that edged the town. As they walked, he shared what he had learned about the danger nearby. "Today I told her about Fenrir Greyback," he said. "He's a notorious werewolf who targets children and seeks to breed more werewolves to overwhelm the wizarding world. He attacked Remus as a child, turning him into a werewolf, supposedly as revenge on Remus's family. Malfoy once used Greyback to intimidate people at Borgin and Burke's, and during the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, he even bit Bill in his untransformed state." Hermione listened, brows furrowed, but she nodded. The woods were quiet around them, and Nurmengard's cold silhouette rose in the distance. The high tower, where the imprisoned seer waited, and where the answers Eno sought, might finally be found.